Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. So we talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Roach Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our video. The NFL season is over with the Kansas City Chiefs winning another Super Bowl under Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. And now our focus shifts to college basketball, where we've got a big matchup on Tuesday night in the ACC with the North Carolina Tar Heels, who are currently at the top of the ACC standings, going to a tricky environment in college basketball at the Syracuse Orange. Can they get a win, or will the Cuse be able to get an upset win over the Tar Heels and help their fading at-large NCAA tournament chances? I'm going to preview and predict who I believe is going to win, so let's get into it. North Carolina, like I said, is currently at the top of the ACC standings at 11-2, and a loss to the Syracuse Orange would definitely not help out their chances of being able to win the conference, because they are only a game ahead of Virginia and a game and a half ahead of Duke, which they still have to travel to the Duke Blue Devils on their schedule. So they can't start slipping up to teams that they should beat, and Syracuse is definitely a team that they should be able to beat, because Syracuse is all the way down at 6-7 in the ACC standings. They're 15-9 overall, and when you look at what both teams have done recently, North Carolina, yes, they've struggled a little bit, losing to Georgia Tech on the road and Clemson at home, but for one thing, Clemson is a solid team. They still shouldn't have lost that game, but I do believe that the Duke game was a big reason that North Carolina lost that game to Clemson and they lost to Georgia Tech, because they looked ahead before the Duke game and had a hangover after it, but then they were able to beat Miami on the road. And yes, North Carolina, it wasn't an all too impressive win, but considering the fact that Miami has beaten North Carolina the last two times and they were able to win on the road, that still is a good win for the Tar Heels. And when you look at Syracuse, they're struggling right now. They were already on the outside looking in for the NCAA tournament a few games ago, but if they had a decent shot to make the tournament back then, they do not right now, because they've lost at Boston College recently, which is not a good loss. They've lost at Wake Forest by 30 points, and they lost to Clemson on their own floor in a game that they had to have. Clemson, like I said earlier, is a good basketball team, but with Syracuse at home, with their home crowd, had to get it done. They barely beat Louisville by 2, and they were able to knock off NC State by a decent amount a few games ago, but still overall, Syracuse is fading fast. Their net ranking is terrible, and they're definitely far out of the NCAA tournament picture right now, but a win over North Carolina could change that and could help at least get them back in the picture for an at-large bid, even though they still would be on the outside with a win here. But the ESPN FPI predictor is not being so kind to the Syracuse Orange, only giving them a 19% chance to win this game, despite the fact that they are at home to North Carolina's 80% chance to win. And when you look at the series recently between these two teams, North Carolina has dominated over Syracuse for the most part. In the last 7 matchups, North Carolina has won 5 of them. Even when you go back to when Jim Boeheim was the head coach of the Syracuse Orange, they were not able to beat North Carolina hardly ever. Back in 2014, they got a win, and then it took them until the 2020 season to beat North Carolina again. And the last time they did win against North Carolina was in the 2020-2021 season with a 2-point win at home. But what concerns me about this game for Syracuse is that even though they are desperate and they really need a win for their NCAA tournament chances to have any shot, they lost to North Carolina already this season, 103-67. And yes, the game was at North Carolina, but that's still a terrible loss. That is why Syracuse's computer metrics are bad, because they've had a few blowout losses this season. You have to be competitive even when you lose. And the reason Syracuse lost that game to North Carolina by as much as they did is because they don't really have a good matchup for Armando Bacot. And now Syracuse's front court is even thinner, because Benny Williams, a depth piece on the Syracuse basketball team, he's been dismissed. He's no longer with the basketball program. Adrian Autry, the replacement to Jim Boeheim, who has had his moments this season in year 1 as the Syracuse head coach, but still he's trying to find his way as a college basketball head coach. He announced that Benny Williams is no longer with the team. So now that leaves it to Chris Bell and Malik Brown, 2 guys who are under the height of 6'9", to try to slow down Armando Bacot. That's going to be an issue. They don't really have any other guys that play down low. Judah Mintz is a fantastic guard, and he has NBA potential. J.J. Starling, the transfer from Notre Dame, he's a solid player as well. But then when you look at North Carolina having Cormac Ryan, R.J. Davis, Elliot Cadeau, they can match Syracuse's backcourt. North Carolina's backcourt is still better than Syracuse's, despite the fact that Syracuse has a solid backcourt. It's just that does not help out Syracuse's chances chances at all. And when you look at the series history when Jim Boeheim was the head coach at Syracuse, a lot of the games were competitive, even if North Carolina would still win because of that 2-3 zone. And Adrian Autry is going to a man-to-man defense. It's no longer that 2-3 zone that gave so many teams fits. And I think that's why North Carolina blitzed Syracuse last time out in Chapel Hill, because Syracuse doesn't really have the front court to slow down guys like Jalen Withers, Armando Bacot, and Harrison Ingram for North Carolina. But the 2-3 zone at least caused North Carolina's guards to have to think, whereas with man-to-man defense, North Carolina was just able to blow them out. I will say that Adrian Autry is starting to incorporate the 2-3 zone a little bit more recently, but it still hasn't helped because Syracuse barely beat the Louisville Cardinals and they just lost to Clemson. In North Carolina's roster, it's just flat out better than Syracuse. RJ Davis, he's having a career year, putting up 22 points per game, 4 boards and 4 assists. He's a legitimate player of the year candidate. Armando Bacot's going to feast against the Syracuse Orange as long as North Carolina gives him the basketball and as long as Syracuse doesn't play a 2-3 zone. If Syracuse tries to play a 2-3 zone, it could cause North Carolina some problems, but with the experience of RJ Davis and just the amount of talent North Carolina has, they should eventually figure it out, you would think. And Armando Bacot having that height advantage, it will be tough for Syracuse to employ the 2-3 zone effectively, but it could work. Harrison Ingram averaging 13 points per game and 9 boards. He's a very good way to beat the zone because he can take jump shots in the middle of the court. He can also shoot in the corner. Cormac Ryan as well, averaging 10 points per game. Elliot Cadeau, Seth Trimble are helping out in the backcourt with RJ Davis, averaging 8 points and 6 points. And then they've got some other depth pieces as well with Jalen Washington and Jalen Withers. This is a very deep North Carolina team, averaging 83 points per game. They shoot 75% at the line and 35% from 3, and they do not turn the basketball over too much. Whereas when you look at Syracuse, they only average 75 points per game, and they only shoot 32% from 3 and 71% at the free throw line. So all of their metrics are worse than the North Carolina Tar Heels. But do I believe that Syracuse can knock off the Tar Heels? I am a big believer that when a team is desperate, it increases their chances to win. Look at Michigan State playing Illinois this past weekend. Illinois was favored to win that game. A lot of people thought they would win, including myself, because of the fact Michigan State was reeling and their NCAA tournament chances were starting to fade a little bit, even though Michigan State is still barely in the tournament field, whereas Syracuse is currently outside of it. But Michigan State really needed to win, and they got it done on their own floor. But that's Tom Izzo, and with Syracuse, they don't have a Hall of Famer at head coach anymore. No more Jim Boeheim like Michigan State does with Tom Izzo. Adrian Autry, he's trying his best, but him going back and forth with this man-to-man defense to a 2-3 zone, Syracuse just does not have an identity as they're trying to transition from the Jim Boeheim era. Adrian Autry is going to have a lot of work to do in that regard. They have some talent on the team in Judah Mintz and J.J. Starling, but their backcourt is not better than North Carolina's backcourt, which usually helps them in some other games when Syracuse has that edge. Syracuse's depth at front court is thin. They're going to have a hard time with Armando Bacot, especially now that Benny Williams has been dismissed from the team. And even though this game is at home, Syracuse has a very tough environment. I think that their crowd is going to be very loud, especially because North Carolina's coming to town. Syracuse just lost to the Clemson Tigers at home, and North Carolina, even though they just lost to Clemson as well, they are a better basketball team overall than Clemson. So I think it will be very tough for Syracuse to knock off the Tar Heels. North Carolina hasn't been looking as good lately, but I do believe that the Tar Heels will knock off the Syracuse Orange 76-68. I think the talent gap is a little bit too much here, and even though North Carolina might struggle a bit with the 2-3 zone if Adrian Autry employs it, Syracuse has not been as effective using the 2-3 zone as they were under Jim Boeheim, and I believe that North Carolina will feast in the front court with Armando Bacot and North Carolina's guard, especially if RJ Davis goes off for 25-plus points. It will be enough for North Carolina to be able to knock off Syracuse and for North Carolina to stay at the top of the ACC standing and to push Syracuse further away of possibly being able to make the NCAA tournament this season. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below about whether you think that Syracuse can upset North Carolina and keep their fading at-large chances for the NCAA tournament alive, or whether you believe that North Carolina will be too much for Syracuse and that they will be able to get a road win to stay atop the ACC standings. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.